Have you ever felt like you're losing half your month to PMS? Like clockwork, the second half of your cycle hits and suddenly you're not you anymore. You're anxious, irritable, craving everything in sight, exhausted, fighting off depression or rage, and wondering why your motivation and libido just ghosted you. Sound familiar? You're not alone. PMS is on the rise, and so is PMDD, premenstrual dysphoric disorder. More and more women are reporting that they spend half of their reproductive lives suffering emotionally and physically, only to be told it's normal. The medical system's go to responses: antidepressants, Lupron, hello chemical menopause, or birth control pills handed out like candy. But what if those solutions are part of the problem? Today, we're pulling back the curtain on what's really going on in our brains and bodies throughout the menstrual cycle with someone who's been blazing a trail in women's health research. Dr. Sarah Hill is a leading evolutionary psychologist and author of two paradigm-shattering books that uncover the hidden truths about women's sex hormones, including This Is Your Brain on Birth Control and her newest book, The Period Brain. With over a decade of research experience and numerous academic publications, she's become one of the most important voices in helping women understand how their biology drives their psychology. So, welcome, Sarah. I am so happy to finally get you on my podcast.
I'm so excited to be here to chat with you.
So, for all of my listeners, I was just telling Sarah before we started recording that I can remember listening to her on a podcast probably 5 years ago on a walk and just being blown away by what she was talking about. And this had to do with her first book, Your Brain on Birth Control. And ever since then, that's a book that I've recommended highly to others to read. And the information that's in that is just incredible. And now you've got this new book, The Period Brain. So when your people reach out to me and were like, "Do you want to interview Sarah?" I'm like, yes, I've been wanting to interview her for 5 years. So yes, thank you. So I'm so happy that we're finally doing this.
Me too. Me too. It's long overdue.
Long overdue. So what made you get into writing this? Like, what prompted you to write The Period Brain?
So with the period brain, it actually started as sort of a biological question. It was the biologist in me that was really interested in trying to get to the bottom of PMS. And the reason for this is that a lot of research has looked at the impact of estrogen, right? And how estrogen, when it's changing across the cycle, how that's related to things like changes in libido, where you have more sexual desire when estrogen is high and rising, and you feel sexier and you look sexier and you smell sexier and sex, and you have more energy and the brain is more excitable. And isn't it all wonderful? And it fits into this really beautiful evolutionary story about estrogen rising and being highest at a time in the cycle when sex can lead to conception. Right. So it makes a
Right.
lot of sense. Like everything makes sense, right? Estrogen, sex, conception, pregnancy, reproduction, evolution, right? All
Yep.
makes sense. And then when you look at progesterone and you look at the types of psychological and behavioral changes that happen in the second half of the cycle, it just looks like PMS. And so
Yeah,
I
a
was
bit.
trying to, I was like looking at the question as a biologist and saying, wait a minute, estrogen is causing this coordinated set of actions that are essentially orienting the body toward attraction and sex, which are sort of like the first job that a female body has to do in order to reproduce. And then as we shift into the second half of the cycle, which is dominated by progesterone, we should expect to see that the body is then shifting gears to be optimized for a state that is ready for implantation and pregnancy. But nobody's really even looked at the question that way. And the only thing that's ever talked about with respect to progesterone is PMS. And so I was just trying to understand, one, why is it that roughly 80% of women have this, syndrome? Like, why do 80% of women feel terrible for 2 weeks out of every month? And is there any wisdom in what our body is actually doing during that time? And has the experience come to be worse for us because we haven't placed enough emphasis on the fact that women are hormonal and that our hormonal changes influence what our bodies and our brains need to thrive? And by ignoring those things, that maybe our luteal phase is a lot worse than what it really needs to be. And so I began to do a deep dive into progesterone, right? And like, what is it doing, right? What are the psychological and behavioral changes that progesterone is supposed to be initiating, right? And how do those things, then influence the way that we experience the world? And why is it that it feels terrible? And
Yes.
yeah, and ultimately what I landed on is that there's a couple of different things going on. So one, progesterone does lead to coordinated changes, both in the physical body and psychologically, that are oriented toward successful implantation and pregnancy, right? And that some of these changes do lead us to feel in a way that's a somewhat more subdued version of ourselves, but there's no reason that we should be feeling terrible. And that a
Hmm.
lot of the terrible feelings that we get, like where we feel full of kind of self-loathing, right? And where we
Yeah.
feel full, like where we're craving, craving all of these foods and beating ourselves up for, not feeling the way that we think that we're supposed to be feeling. A lot of that is completely unnecessary. And it's really the result of the fact that we've ignored this really critical part of our cycle. And that if we are paying attention to it and paying attention and learn to listen to what our body is telling us that it needs during this time, that we can actually feel a whole lot better than most of us do now. Right. And so that's another part of the puzzle. And then, lastly, the world has changed a lot, since the time of our distant ancestors. And
Yes.
so there's a lot about the way that our brain and body work that are no longer matched well to the environment, right? And so there's also some changes that have happened in the last, 200 years where we have, processed foods and sedentary lifestyles, and there's a lack of social support, and people have chronic, unrelenting stress. All of these things also then erode at our resilience to hormonal changes, leading to extreme sensitivity to hormonal changes. And you and I were talking about this off camera, where we were talking about this idea of especially sensitivity to progesterone and changes in progesterone. And that also can contribute to a lot of the negative feelings that women have in the luteal phase. And so it's a really complex answer. And so the book is really about working through how do our hormones shape our experiences? How can we learn about what our body actually needs and is asking for in the luteal phase? And then what are some things that we can do to help honor what our body is asking for, but then also to help build our resilience to hormonal changes to try to take the edge off of this hormonal sensitivity that so many women now exhibit.
Yes. Okay.
A lot
Like,
there.
no, I love it because when I was reading your book, it was like, yes, yeah. Why do we feel like this? And why, like been a lot of education, I feel like, around, cycle syncing and like, learning how to work out when, throughout your cycle and how to eat and fast throughout your cycle. But it's still, a lot of people aren't explaining why is it that we feel the way we do? And should we be feeling this terrible? And it's like I want to make sense of it too, just like you did. Do you, in your research, did you come across anything that showed, 200 years ago, even 100 years ago, was PMS a lot less than what we're seeing today? Do we know the answer to that?
Well, we don't necessarily know the answer to that, but there are clues. All right, so one clue that we can look at is just looking at cross-cultural research in terms of PMS experiences around the world. And you can look at whether or not there are differences based on different levels of modernity. And what you tend to see is that, and this is sort of a surprising answer to people, is that no matter where it is around the world that you ask people about their moods and measure their mood changes across the cycle, even in places in the world where they don't have access to the kinds of foods that we do and don't have, exposure to as many endocrine disrupting compounds as we do, you tend to find a lowering of mood premenstrually. And I'm defining premenstrually relatively loosely here in terms of the last 2 weeks or the last week. They divide it up in different ways of the menstrual cycle. And what you find is all around the world, women experience this downshift in mood, right? And so this part is relatively consistent and likely has been something that has been true throughout history, is that
Okay.
there is a downshift in our mood prior to in the second half of the cycle compared to the first. And this is something that evolutionarily actually makes a lot of sense. Like when you're in the luteal phase, this is an incredibly metabolically expensive phase of the cycle. Because progesterone, it increases your basal body temperature, which means that our metabolism increases by roughly 7 to 11% when we're experiencing progesterone release. And this means that our calorie needs are higher. There's something like 100, you need like an additional like 150 to 200 calories a day in the luteal phase just because your body is working harder and it's creating all of this new tissue to differentiate the endometrial layer. And it's this really metabolically expensive time. And our
Mm.
bodies actually release, one of the things that progesterone does that's so amazing is that when it's being broken down in the body, it releases allopregnanolone, which activates GABAergic activity in the brain and dials things down, right? It actually it's a slowing, it's an inhibitory form of neurotransmission, so it slows the brain down. It lowers our motivational states in terms of going out and like seeking opportunities, right? It kind of lowers all of that and makes us more chilled out and relaxed. And it dampens reward sensitivity to rewards like things like sex and social activity, right? So during the first half of the cycle, our brain is very much oriented toward others. Like we want to be out there in the world and meeting new people and attracting partners and we have a lot of energy to go and do those things, and we're also very motivated to go and do those things.
Which is driven
And
by estrogen
which
and the
is, yeah,
testosterone in the first half of the cycle.
yeah,
And
it
that's,
absolutely
yeah,
is. Yeah, and all of that again is oriented toward attraction and mating and the sex. And then
yeah.
with the second half of the cycle, it's oriented toward preparing your body for implantation and pregnancy. And so the volume is being turned down on external sources of pleasure because essentially your body is trying to keep you safe and at home and maintaining, as many and trying to conserve as many calories as you possibly can for all of these expensive building projects that are going on in the body. And so there's some element of, the sort of PMS experience in terms of lowering mood that is likely something that has happened since the dawn of time, right? Because these are actually functional shifts. But when we talk about like the more extreme forms where it's just like extreme sadness, right?
Hmm.
Those things are probably more common now. And the
Yeah.
reason for that is a lot of the extreme feelings that we have around, sadness and, as we were mentioning before, rage. These sorts of things oftentimes are the result of an erosion in our cellular flexibility to be able to quickly adapt to hormonal changes. And currently, from the research that is out there, we know that cellular plasticity, which allows for quick adaptation to changing levels of hormones, that's something that gets eroded by inflammatory activity in the body. And so
Oh,
inflammation is a big driver, and also dysregulation of your stress brain axis, your HPA axis. Those two things together, chronic inflammation and dysregulation of the HPA axis, which are oftentimes overrelated, like they tend to be related to one another just simply because the HPA axis, that stress axis, also plays a role in regulating inflammatory activity. But
okay.
those two things tend to erode at our resilience to hormonal changes and then makes these experiences that we have in the luteal phase more unpleasant than what they need to be.
And how is it eroding them? Like, can you explain what's happening on
Yeah,
like
yeah.
on the brain level?
Yeah, so because whenever you have hormonal changes, you
Hmm.
get not only the changes in hormone, which are obviously, I mean, that's one thing that the body needs to adapt to. And in the luteal phase, you have this huge rise and fall of progesterone. And even though we tend to, like, if you ever see that little picture of the menstrual cycle where it shows this bump in
Hmm.
estrogen and then it shows this comparably sized bump in progesterone in the second half of the cycle, that's actually not drawn to scale. And levels of progesterone peak at levels that are 10 times higher than peak levels of estrogen in the first half of the cycle. So you're going
Yeah.
through these huge hormonal changes, right? So you're getting a huge rise and fall of progesterone along with a second rise and fall of estrogen, because that also rises and falls in the second half of the cycle. But in addition to just those changes in hormones there, these changes in levels of estrogen and then levels of progesterone also initiate a whole bunch of changes in things like neurotransmission, right? And so,
Yes.
for example, like the modulation of things like dopamine and the modulation of things like serotonin are influenced by hormonal changes. And so, when you have these big wild swings in hormones that you get in the second half of the cycle, there's a lot of changes going on in the brain in terms of neurotransmission, both from the hormones themselves, but then also from the downstream effects that they have on regulating neurotransmission. And so when I talk about like eroding, cellular or the resilience to hormonal changes, essentially it's like the cells in the body are less plastic, meaning that when things are changing, they're less able to adapt quickly. And just
Okay.
to give you an example of this, when progesterone is rising, right, it's being that when it gets broken down, it releases allopregnanolone. And we know that allopregnanolone is a potent modulator of GABA A receptors in the brain. Right. So GABA A receptors are they essentially, when they get something binding to them, they create inhibitory neurotransmission in the brain. So it slows the brain down. Right. Now, when the brain is getting overwhelmed by something, right? So there's just all of this allopregnanolone. What the brain will do is it'll actually downregulate the receptors. So that way it doesn't create an experience of overwhelm, right? So it's like, okay, in order to maintain homeostasis, I can't have all of these receptors out there, right? Because right now I'm being like, stimulated to death. So what the brain does is it retreats, right? It down regulates receptors. Right.
Ah.
Then when progesterone starts to fall, the brain is like, oh no, like where did it all go? And so it'll start to upregulate the receptors, right? And so essentially the brain, I mean, all the cells in the body are including those in the brain. They used to think that the brain was this like static thing that we built and then it was, then it was just there for the, in this like solid form and never changed. But the brain is a I mean, it's a process. It is an unfolding process constantly. And the brain changes to adapt to the cycle. And one of those ways that it does that is by upregulating and downregulating receptors as a way to prevent itself from becoming totally overwhelmed with different forms of hormonal signaling or neurotransmission. Now, when you have a cell that is being exposed to chronic inflammatory activity, that decreases that plasticity. And so the brain isn't able to as quickly adapt. It's not able to as quickly, upregulate and downregulate receptors. It's not as able to as quickly, because there's also this process where the GABA A receptors need to be rearranged in a certain way in order to receive this allopregnanolone reception.
Oh.
And that's also something that can get slowed in the context of chronic inflammatory activity. And so anytime that you are, not in good physical health, if you're not trying to if your health is poor because of, different types of lifestyle factors, you're not getting daylight, you're not getting sleep, you don't have quality relationships with people, you aren't eating the right foods, you're not getting physical activity, all of these things erode at our body's ability to quickly adapt, right? It erodes at our resilience. And having that resilience and doing things to help build up that resilience is something that we can do to make the experience of transitioning between the early phase in the cycle, like the follicular phase in the cycle when estrogen is high, and then transition into the luteal phase where you have that rise and fall of progesterone. And it can make all of that a lot more pleasant when we take steps, like active steps, to try to
Mhm.
promote our cellular plasticity and our resilience to hormonal changes.
So would this apply then for like if you experience childhood trauma or adulthood PTSD and things like
Mhm.
this, where would that erode away and so that it would make it so that you're not adapting to those things as well?
Yes, and in fact, if you look at some predictors of developing PMDD, two of the big ones are trauma. So there's an asymmetrically high number of women who have PMDD who've experienced trauma. And so those two things tend to co-vary, which is consistent with this idea that dysregulation in the stress brain axis is playing a role. Another predictor, autoimmune disease. And that's another case where you have chronic inflammatory activity,
Right.
again, eroding at your resilience to hormonal changes. And so these two things, trauma and then autoimmune disease, they tend to be predictive of worse PMS, and they are predictive of the development of PMDD. And my guess is, although I'm not as familiar with this research, my guess is that that's also going to create problems. It probably is a potent risk factor for both postpartum depression and
Yeah.
then having a difficult perimenopausal experience. Because
Yes.
women who are sensitive to hormonal changes are sensitive to hormonal changes. And
Yeah.
that usually, and so what you tend to find is that people who had bad PMS or bad PMDD, they tend to be at a greater risk of developing postpartum depression. And they're also at a greater risk of developing depression during the perimenopausal transition. And so it again speaks to a common mechanism, and that common mechanism being a lack of resilience to hormonal changes. And that's something that I spend a lot of time talking about in my book, is that, even though our experiences as we transition from this estrogenic, sort of high energy, high sexual desire, phase of our cycle, and then transition into this other one that's a little bit more subdued, and it's about energy conservation. And it's about, lowering sexual desire and lowering our desire to just go out and do, sort of energy expending activities. And that you're going to feel that, as you shift. And even like, I talk in my book about, there's research even on baboons where,
Yeah.
the female baboons during the follicular phase of the cycle, they'll be down on the ground and grooming each other and hanging out with the other females. And then during their version of the luteal phase, they like want to go and hide in a tree. They spend more time alone in trees, and they also get into more agonistic conflict with the other females. And so, I mean, and what this tells us, along with the cross-cultural work, is that there is some element, of these shifts that we experience that are very universal. And they're because our
Hmm.
body, again, is orienting from being something that's optimized for attraction and sex to this other job that our bodies have to do to reproduce. If you're a female, it's about having to have sex and conceive, and then have implantation and be able to be pregnant, right? And each cycle is like a little snapshot of those activities, right? With the first half of the cycle being attraction and sex, and the second half being implantation and pregnancy. And so you're going to feel a little bit of that in terms of our motivational changes and that sort of thing. But it doesn't need to feel terrible. And the terrible feelings oftentimes are a result of this erosion of our resilience to hormonal changes. And this is something where, if you address that now, especially as a cycling woman, it will make for a better postpartum experience. It'll make for a better perimenopausal experience, because the mechanisms do seem to be shared.
I'm so happy that we're finally having science to back this stuff up, like explanations that make sense. It's like, oh, that's why. And it all comes, everything seems to always come back to biology, and that we are really just here to procreate. It's like everything has to be based around that. And I think that nowadays women, because we're very, we've taken back our power, and we're in the workforce, and we're not just out there to be mothers and caretaking homes. But unfortunately, our biology has not caught up to that. And it doesn't matter if you don't want to have kids, or if you know, choosing to just, be the businesswoman. It doesn't matter. Your biology is still wired to procreate. So these hormone fluctuations are not going to change. And so it's like you're better off to work with your biology and go, okay, that, I'm meant to be procreating. This is why I'm here on earth, whether I like it or not. Right?
Yeah, no, totally, totally. I mean, the fact is, we have inherited a brain, right, that is wired for sex and reproduction. And the
Yeah.
reason for this is because, our all of our ancestors, 100% of our direct ancestors successfully reproduced, right? We are the result of an unbroken chain of successful
Right.
sex,
Yeah.
pregnancy, and childbirth for millions of years, which is really incredible to think of. And even though our distant ancestors might not have had anything else in common with each other, the thing that they did have in common with each other is that they had sex, they had a baby, and that baby survived alive long enough, to be able to have babies of its own. And so it's like we do have this brain that is wired for this process. And again, as you said, whether we want to have children or not, and recognizing that yes, our brain is wired to do this. Doesn't it, and that this isn't the same as saying this is what we should be doing, or
No.
this is the only natural thing for women to do. It's like those two things are totally unrelated to each other. Right, like
Yeah.
what our brain is sort of wired to do is like nothing. It says nothing about what any of us should be doing, right?
Yeah.
Biology
Yeah.
is not a roadmap for what we should be doing in life, right? As I always tell I teach a class in evolutionary psychology, and one of the things that I always tell them, because we do learn a lot about, some things about human nature that are really beautiful and amazing, but also some things that are not necessarily our favorite topics to learn about, and
Yeah.
humans are capable also of doing terrible things. And just because we have a biological explanation for things, right, it doesn't mean that it's right or good. And sort of like, one of the examples I talk about is, having a baby before it's due is something that historically would have meant that the baby dies.
Hmm.
But we don't think that's a good idea. And so now we have NICUs that save these babies, because,
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
used to be that mothers who had large babies would die in childbirth. And we don't think that's a good idea either, even though it's natural,
Yeah.
and so we intervene.
Exactly.
And so it's
Yes.
like not using biology as sort of a roadmap for what you should be doing is an important thing to keep in mind anytime we're talking about anything
Yeah.
biological about us that can seem to be like, wait a minute, does that mean that if you don't want to have children, that's not natural? No, it's
Exactly.
no,
No.
that's not what that means at
No.
all.
No,
Yeah.
we are feminists, aren't we, Sarah? We
Yeah,
believe
we
in
are.
women's rights, and I
Yes.
get it, but I always go back to this, like when I talk about diet and exercise and all of these things, sex. Oh my God,
Yeah.
sex! Like, come on, women have it in their head. I think 90% of them have it in their head that they are broken because they don't want to have sex 24/7 like their male counterpart does. And they're
Yes.
like, what is wrong with me? Like, I just want more of a sex drive. And I'm like, actually, you're supposed to just want sex for like a week out of the month, if that, like,
You're right. Yeah. Yeah. No, it's really, and this is another one of the messages in the book is that I think that there's so many women who feel like their body is the enemy and that they're
yes.
broken because we've
Yeah.
only been given sort of a male version of what it means to be normal and what it means to be human,
Hmm.
right? And the male version of sexual desire is one size fits all, right? Every day is the same day sexually. And so, we think then, oh, well, we're supposed to be feeling equal amounts of sexual desire every day. And if we don't, then it means there's a problem, right?
Hmm.
And the problem is either us or the problem is with our relationship, and we begin to overthink it and think like, oh my goodness, like what's wrong with me? And like, oh no, or what's wrong with my relationship? Is my relationship in trouble because I'm not feeling
Yes.
strong sexual attraction, every day of the week? And the fact is our sexual desire is cyclical and it tends to map onto the times in the cycle when sex is conceptive. And most
Hmm.
women find that you get a strong increase in sexual desire that happens the week usually leading up to ovulation and right around ovulation itself. So between
Yep.
like days 7 to 14 of the cycle, most women feel most sexually aroused. They tend to have more sex. They feel sexier, which is also a really important part of the female sexual response is not just about how you feel about your partner, it's how you feel about yourself.
Yeah.
And women feel sexier at that time. They have more sex. They, have more desire. And then after they ovulate and progesterone starts getting released, that is the cue to the brain that sex can no longer lead to conception. Right. And so during that moment, when your brain starts to get that neurotransmission, it taps the brakes on sexual desire because it's not going to lead to any further reproduction, right? Because you can't get pregnant when progesterone is being released. That means you've entered a time in the cycle when sex will be non-conceptive. So it's telling the brain like, there's not, we're not going to get pregnant from the sex that we have. So it taps the brakes there because the benefits are relatively low in terms of conception. And then there's also costs associated with sexual behavior. And one is metabolically costly, just because sex is an
Ah,
activity. It is a
okay.
physical
Yeah.
activity, right? But it's also physiologically costly in terms of the fact that it creates a small inflammatory event in the vaginal canal and near the cervix. And this is because when you have sperm entering your body, or even not sperm, you just have a penis, or not even a penis, if there's just anything that's entering that part of your body, it's going to leave behind some non-self DNA, right? And whenever you have DNA that does not belong to you, your immune system goes after it because that's usually the hallmark of like a bacteria or a virus or a parasite. And so if the immune system recognizes non-self DNA, it creates an inflammatory event to clear up whatever the potential threat might be. And this is something that is metabolically costly because it does raise the core body temperature anytime you have any type of inflammation in the body. It's costly that way, but it also can potentially interfere with, especially in what we call the implantation window, which is this period of time when the uterus is actually receptive to implantation from a fertilized egg or an embryo. And during that time, inflammatory activity can potentially impede successful implantation. And so this is one of the reasons that women have a lower sexual desire during the second half of the cycle. Now, what's also interesting about that, like just to sort of talk to the other side of it, is that even though human females like do have lower libido and they tend to have less sex in the second half of the cycle, as far as like a species goes, we have a ton of sex in the luteal phase compared
Yeah.
to just about any other species that's out there because most female mammals, and we are a female mammal, only have sex during what we call estrus, which is that period of time when sex can lead to conception. And so we're actually one of the oddballs in the biological world in that we do have sex across the cycle. And what's cool about this is it tells us about some of the other benefits that we get from sex, and that includes our bonding with partners.
Yeah.
And sex does really provide an important form of bonding with partners. And what research finds is that when women are having sex in the luteal phase, that oftentimes it's motivated by a desire for closeness with their partner to a much greater extent than it is the need to scratch a sexual itch, which is generally
Yes.
what sex is more about in the first half of the cycle.
I
And
loved
so
I loved reading this in your book. Just yeah, keep going.
yeah,
Sorry.
yeah, no. So even the function that sex serves differs across the cycle. And I think that understanding this about yourself, A, that it's totally normal to have cycling desire, right? And two, that the meaning of sex actually changes to our body across the cycle, right? And that during the first half of the cycle, it is about just like having the sexual itch that you need to have scratched, right? It's about attraction and it's about, pleasure and it's about, yeah, scratching the itch. And then with the second half of the cycle, it tends to be more about connection. And understanding this also,
It's
can help you
great.
communicate with your partner
Yeah.
to help them understand what it's about. Because, like, for example, during the ovulatory phase, like right near ovulation, when, sexual desire tends to be high and it's when sex can lead to conception, women might feel like a afternoon 5-minute quickie before they have to hit the gym is like an amazing idea and it feels really good and that's exactly what they want. But then, 2 weeks later, when they're in the middle of the luteal phase, like that's probably not going to hit right. Right. And in
Yeah.
fact, it might sort of trigger the alarm bells. Like, wait a minute. Like, no,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
do
What
you,
are
you
you
don't want to
doing
spend
trying to
time with
have
me?
sex with me?
Yeah, it's don't like I need more time than that. Like don't you
Yeah.
value me? Don't you?
Yeah.
And so it can turn into this totally different thing. And understanding that, being able to talk to yourself about it, because I don't most women don't even have the language to explain this themselves. They just think that there's something
Totally.
wrong with
Yep.
them. Or
Yep.
like and but to have that language and then also to be able to communicate it with your partner is like
It's
a
huge.
total game changer. I mean, it's like true intimacy is
Yeah.
like being able to share about all of this and then make sure that everybody's getting what they need out of a sexual encounter and out of the relationship.
Yeah. And when I first was reading that in your book, I'm like, well, yeah, we have more sex in the luteal phase than other species. And that's just because we feel pressured into it or feel like we should be because of our male counterpart who wants to have sex all of the time.
Yeah.
And then I kept reading and I'm like, oh, actually, no, there's research to back this up. And oh my gosh, probably like 7 years ago, I remember my girlfriend Janet saying to me that she she saw sex in two different phases. She said, in the first half of the month, she said, I told my husband, like, come get it when you want. Like, I'm so much more up for it during this half of the month. And, I don't need as much foreplay. I'm a little spicier, like,
Yeah.
bring it on, And she said, but then the second half of my cycle, she said, I told him, like, look, I don't feel like having sex. This is more about, connecting than anything. And I need more foreplay. I need more romance. I need more just love and affection. And then I'll be more up to having the sex because it'll be about connection rather than the actual act of sex. And so I went and I told my husband this, and he says to this day that was the best thing I ever taught him was knowing that I am completely different in the second half of my cycle. And he understands that now. And it is a huge relief off my shoulders.
Well, and I'm sure it's a huge relief off his shoulders. I mean,
Oh,
I can't tell.
totally.
I mean, I can't tell you the number of emails I've gotten from male readers, and this was just of my first book, where I didn't go into as much detail in what happens across the cycle with sexual desire, but I did talk a little bit. I touched on the fact that women's sexual desire peaks, near ovulation, and then it tends to fall off a cliff to some degree in the second half. And I got so many emails from men saying, this paragraph kind of changed my life because if my partner didn't want to have sex with me, I assumed that I did something wrong or that there was something wrong with the relationship because that's how I would feel. Like that's what, not wanting sex would mean for me. But it's totally different for women. And
Yeah.
having that information, I think, because I think that there's also something that happens with men, especially in long-term relationships, where it's almost like it's like sex is almost like a litmus test. You know what I mean? To like see how things are going in the relationship and make sure that they've still got it and all of this other stuff. And I think that understanding that in the second half of the cycle, not wanting sex has nothing to do with you. It also takes pressure off them to feel like they need to
Mhm.
be initiating sex all the time as a way to test, how things are going in the relationship. Because I also think that there's an element of that goes on with men, and I think that it really is a huge relief in a lot of ways to everyone. And also, yeah, as
Yeah.
you said, like understanding that if you want, sexuality and sexual expression to be part of the relationship in a really meaningful way in the second half of the cycle, that it's just going to require a little bit more groundwork to be laid because there is a broader context that becomes really important in the second half of the cycle to a greater extent than what is true in the first half.
Yeah. And it made me feel so much less guilty and just like more up for it. Like I actually started having more sex with my husband because rather than being like, I don't want to have sex right now. Then it was more like, you know what? I don't have a libido right now, but this is when I get to connect with my husband. Like we're not touchy-feely people.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so it is that is our time where we connect and we, hold each other and all those nice romantic things. And so it's like, I'm gonna do this to just be close with my husband. And then it would totally shift it for me. And then I wanted to have sex, even though the libido wasn't there still. It's okay. I still wanted to have that sex with him. And so I think it can really help your sex life with your partner when you can talk about this. And then also like coming from the biological perspective of all of this, like we understand now what's happening in our body. And now we can look at the male body as well and go, okay, they have testosterone pretty much the same, like they have seasonal fluctuations in testosterone, but
Right.
pretty much it's the same every day for most of them. And they are just meant to spread their seed, which is really unfortunate. Like it's the most unfair thing that whoever made us did to us. Like really, truly, it's like the male counterpart wants to have sex every day and can physically have sex every day. And then we're over here going, oh, we're producing progesterone now. We're just getting
Yeah.
ready for pregnancy. So,
Yeah.
back
So
off.
sorry.
Like
Yeah. Later.
next
Later.
time I'm just going to use the excuse, oh, actually, I'm in the second half of my cycle right now, and so I can't have your DNA. What did you call it? The DNA
It's non-self DNA.
non-self. Sorry, I can't have any non-self DNA right now. It's not going to work. That's going to be my new
I think
excuse.
I think we need a t-shirt made. I think we need a t-shirt made. No non-self DNA today,
Yeah.
please.
Yeah. Exactly. I love it. Oh my gosh. Yes. Okay. Well, we've got understanding of why this happens. And what makes me also mad, let me just say, as you're talking, I'm like, why couldn't it have been that, okay, we ovulate, progesterone is now being produced in case of implantation, but why
Mm,
didn't the body then go, oh, no implantation happened on day
hmm
14 to 16 or whatever that little window is. It's like a
Right.
48-hour window when we can conceive.
hmm
Okay, then stop with the other stuff because we're not pregnant. So all
Yeah.
everything come back to normal. Like, why didn't
Yeah.
that happen?
Yeah, it's so interesting because this is actually a question that we're really starting to try to unpack in my lab because,
Okay.
on the one hand, if the body is reading progesterone levels as levels, it's like, okay, so, when it's rising, there's a possibility for implantation, right? Or you're gearing up for the implantation window, and then when it's falling,
It's
it's
saying it
still
didn't
it
happen.
didn't, but the levels are the same as they were when it was rising, if that makes sense. So the body is
Yes,
just
right.
reading progesterone. Then it's like, all right, possibility of pregnancy, but it might be smarter than that, right? And it might be able to like distinguish not just levels of progesterone, but whether levels are increasing or decreasing. And if that's the case, then we should expect to see even more specificity in what our experiences are in the luteal phase than what's currently recognized and appreciated in the literature. And so one thing that we're doing right now is just looking at it to start with a starting question of mood and looking at whether your mood changes differ even when progesterone levels are roughly the same based on whether or not progesterone levels yesterday were lower or higher than what they are today. So is it rising or is it falling? Because when it's
Mm.
rising, that suggests, okay, pregnancy might happen, right? When it's falling, it suggests, no, that is not what happened. And that might actually create different types of psychological states. It might create different types of physiological states. And so we're trying to get a better handle on the differences in whether progesterone levels are rising or falling. And there's some evidence that suggests, like, for example, during the late luteal phase, which sometimes is defined as just a couple days before your period starts, but often is described as the during that second week when progesterone is falling, that this is when women's negative mood symptomology, some of it seems to peak. And so there's some different ideas being kicked around about why that might be, in particular with anxiety, because
Mhm.
the idea is that, again, when people don't have the resilience to hormonal changes and their cells aren't able to quickly adapt, that all of a sudden not getting a lot of GABAergic activity, so not having that calming GABA response in your brain from allopregnanolone, when you start to have levels of that being pulled away, that this might, because you're not getting enough inhibitory neurotransmission, that it might lead to anxiety, right? If you're not able to quickly adapt to those types of changes. And so we're looking at some issues related to that and then related to different things with sleep and appetite as well.
And then have you looked at the different levels of the neurotransmitters when these fluctuations are happening?
No, so this is that's like a hard thing
Thing to
to
test.
measure. And so there
And
are ways
everybody's
that
is
you can,
different.
well, and you can measure it using like peripheral measures. So you can like look at these different metabolites in urine, and you can look at
Yes.
things in the periphery like blood. But like there's not a whole lot of consensus about whether peripheral levels of blood, for example, are going to reflect what's going on in the central nervous system or not. And so it's just like one of those things that's a little bit tricky to know for sure. But
There's
I mean, we could
gotta be
certainly,
something
I
going
mean,
on
you
there
can measure, yeah, I would assume so. I would
because
assume so.
being in the world of HRT, and this is,
Mhm.
I kept thinking about this when I was reading your book, and I'm like, but why is it then that women that start, let's say they start estrogen therapy,
Mhm.
they get those same benefits that they
Mhm.
see in the first half of their cycle. They get
Mhm.
more energy, less depression, their brain wakes up, they feel sexier, their libido comes up, their energy. But progesterone, you put in progesterone, HRT to a woman, and as long as she doesn't have progesterone sensitivity, she feels great on it.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, like she's not getting overly fatigued, overly emotional. She's not having all of these things that you're kind of saying that are from this preparation for pregnancy from the
Hmm.
progesterone
Hmm.
doesn't happen with HRT.
Right, right. It also doesn't happen during pregnancy, which there's some research,
Right.
yeah, and there's some research looking into dose-dependent effects. And my guess is that with HRT, that the doses that you're giving are not I mean, typical physiologic levels that you get in the luteal phase. I'm assuming you're talking about like what, like 100 micrograms or something like that. Like the, like, do you know what the
We,
dosages are?
yeah, which is it's apparently pretty equivalent to what we produce, but it's given in static, right? So we're not, some people that cycle their HRT will go up really high on
Mm-hmm,
day
mm-hmm,
21 of
mm-hmm,
the
mm-hmm.
faux cycle in menopause.
Right.
But in most cases, women are either doing 100 to 200 milligrams of
Mm-hmm,
oral
mm-hmm,
progesterone,
mm-hmm,
which
mm-hmm.
equates to about 20 to 40 milligrams of actual
Oh,
progesterone.
okay.
So it's
Got it.
all
Got
getting
it.
converted to the metabolites. And then
Right,
if you
right.
use topical progesterone, it's recommended that it's around 50, sometimes even 70 milligrams, 75 milligrams, depending on how well you absorb it.
Mm-hmm.
But that seems to give the protection for the uterine lining and gives you the nice calming, anti-anxiety, sleep effects that progesterone can give you. But you're not, but like since I've been using progesterone HRT cyclically and I use estrogen every day, I no longer have PMS, like maybe a little bit, but before I was one of these women that you talk about in the book, like 80% of women, where it was like second half of my cycle, I'd have breast tenderness and bloating and emotional and like not wanting to have sex and just blah, like all
Right.
of the
Yeah.
things I had, and I don't
Right.
have them anymore.
Yeah, and I'm thinking that I mean, it's an issue of the hormone sensitivity, right? Or the sensitivity to hormonal
To the
changes.
fluctuations.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because it's like when you have the same dose and you're not getting those wild swings, then it's relatively easy to maintain like a homeostatic state, which is what the body likes to do. And then, like I said, there's some really interesting research being done right now looking at dose dependence and whether
Hmm.
or not there aren't some dosage related effects in that that the sort of negative mood changes may not be like something that happens when it's really high or when it's moderate low, and that it may be something that's in this sort of like what would normally be a Goldilocks zone of just sort of in the middle where people, feel great, but that with progesterone, it may have this opposite type of an effect where it would be like a U-shaped function in terms of mood, with lower levels and really high levels being something that are associated with more positive outcomes, and the middle gray areas being related to to less of this. And in terms of, whether or not that will end up being supported in multiple
Hmm.
studies, I have no idea. But it's just going to show, there's so much less known about
Yeah,
this
there really
hormone
is.
and this whole phase of the cycle than there is
Yeah.
about estrogen.
Yeah.
The bias in research is really, it's pretty profound. It's like there's something like twice as many papers that have been published looking at estrogen as there are with progesterone, despite the fact that progesterone gets released at higher volumes, and so
Yeah.
obviously it's doing something important, our body wouldn't be producing so much of it.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And why women, if they get a hysterectomy, we always still say, still take progesterone.
Yeah, I
Like,
would. Yeah, so I just learned that that they were only giving it to people with uteruses. I mean, for the most part, that most doctors, and I'm
so
like,
dumb.
what? Like what? Like that doesn't
Yeah.
even make any
No,
sense. So it's like, okay,
no,
well, no, estrogen does all this stuff to the brain, but progesterone just protecting the uterus. I mean, give me a break.
no, no,
It's like
no.
it's
We need it for bones, our heart, our brain,
yeah,
our skin, our like it just the list goes on and on. Mood, and
yes,
it's protective of the breast tissue. It's so
yes,
important. It goes
it
way
is.
beyond the uterus.
It
But
does go
yeah.
way beyond the uterus. Yeah, my friend Jolene Brighton, I don't know if you
Yeah,
know
yeah,
her.
yeah, she does great
Yeah,
work. Yeah.
she does do great work. And she was saying one time about the uterus. She's like, it's not Las Vegas. What happens here doesn't stay here.
That's perfect.
And I'm like, that's so awesome. I love it. I'm stealing that.
Yeah, yeah. And you bring up a good point in the book too about, you know, maybe we just want estrogen all the time because estrogen makes us feel so good. So let's just like forget the progesterone because it's making us feel like crap for so many women.
Yeah.
But like you said, then that becomes too much. And actually, when you become estrogen dominant, which Jolene talks a lot about, that's not a good state to be in either. Like you
No, that
don't
does
want
not
that.
feel good. Yeah,
No.
and that's another Las Vegas metaphor right there, is it really does feel like that third or fourth day in Las Vegas where you're like, all right, this is enough. It's
Yeah.
like enough with the whistles and the
Yeah.
bells and the lights and the smoke and the, casino sounds. Like I am just out. Like peace
Yeah.
out. I want to go and take a nap
Yeah. I don't
somewhere
want to feel
quiet.
sexy all the time.
Yes,
No.
exactly. Like I'm gonna put on some sweatpants and yeah, it's like women work best in a state of balance. And one of the key ways that our bodies balance themselves out is with, through the release of estrogen and then progesterone. It does create this really powerful balance.
Mhm. Now, it's really nice for like to think of the idea of, okay, well, we understand now that our body's completely different in the second half of our cycle due to this progesterone and getting ready for pregnancy, which is so stupid that it has to do that every single month. Like, hello.
No, come
But
on.
whatever, it's there, it's not going away. So let's try and work with it. And that's a really nice thought to go, oh, okay, so for the second half of your cycle, do more yoga, take more time for yourself, like, relax and chill. And it's like that just doesn't fit with the majority of our lives anymore. Have
Right.
you read The Red Tent?
No, no. So I've heard
Oh,
about the
you
red tent though.
you have
I
got to
know.
read
I
it.
know. I know.
It's one of my favorite books of all time. But in it, the women would go into the red tent for the week of their menstrual cycle. They'd all bleed together. The full moon would be out or whatever, and they'd go into their tent and talk. And they wouldn't have to do any of their duties for that week. And it's like, oh, well,
Where
doesn't
do I
that sound
sign up?
lovely?
Yeah, I was
Yeah,
gonna say,
right? Like,
where do I go to get to this red tent? What's the address of the tent?
we're coming. Sarah and I will be there
We'll be
when our
there
cycle
with our
comes.
nicotine gum.
Exactly. We were talking about nicotine gum prior to this and how I'm telling her that she needs to get on it because it's so great for the brain when you're going to be doing a podcast. But, anyways, yes, it's like all good to say these things and to
Mhm,
say to a woman, like, just work with your cycle. But it's
mhm,
really hard and I fight it because I'm
mhm,
running a business. My business
mhm.
can't just be put on hold for 2 weeks, but my
Right.
creativity goes down. Like
Mhm,
many things start to go down the closer I
mhm,
get to the period, and
mhm,
it's
mhm.
like, is nowhere near as bad as it used to be, but it's still there. And for many women, this is the case. It's like, well, I have a job. I can't go into my red
Yeah.
tent. Thanks, guys. But,
Yeah.
I've got kids. Women
Right.
are starting to be mothers a lot later in life. So people, that are in their 30s that have a lot of hormonal dysfunction and PMS, they've got little kids running around
Mhm,
and you
mhm.
can't just check out. And so it's
Right.
so hard.
Right, right. And I think that it's made harder by the fact that we feel like we need to be outputting the exact same every
I
single
know.
day.
Yeah.
And we spend a lot of time punishing ourselves for not being who we think that we're supposed to be
Yep.
instead of embracing the fact that we're cyclical. I think that, so for me, one of the really powerful things about understanding the way that all of this works has been one, letting go of the idea of one size fits all for
Mhm.
myself, right? And this doesn't mean that, that I have to like ask everybody in my, who works in my lab, like, just so you know, I'm on the luteal phase, I'm not returning emails and let's schedule
I'm gonna
meetings
start
when I'm
doing that
when yeah,
auto reply.
I don't reply.
Sorry, but right now I'm in
So
my luteal
I'm
phase,
in the
so
luteal
I will not
phase.
get back to you till I'm back in the
Yeah.
follicular.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's so great. Or like, oh, and we got to schedule meetings around my ovulation so that way I can be
Right.
cute and charming. And obviously there's this really extreme version where you have to eat these very specific things. But
Yeah.
what I've found is that if you understand what your body is doing and you listen to it, so I find that I go to bed earlier, for example, when I'm in the luteal phase, and I try to make a point of it, especially if I'm exerting myself, because it is harder for me to do like resistance training during the luteal phase, and I've actually shifted to really not doing much resistance training at all during the last 2 weeks in the cycle, and I just do a ton of it during the first 2 weeks, and
Yeah.
I feel a lot better
That's
doing
good.
things that way, and I'm stronger. I've actually gotten a little bit stronger, so my weight has increased, the amount of weight I'm able to lift. And so I found that that's really helpful, but it's not like I don't think that it's necessary, but even just understanding that if you are going to be, doing heavy resistance training throughout the month, it might feel harder. And it's not because of any personal failing on your own, on your part. And it's not because you're doing something wrong. And it's just because your body right now is not oriented toward building new muscle tissue, right? It's trying to build an endometrial layer. It's sopping up a bunch of amino acids that it's using for that
Yeah,
purpose.
that was so fascinating. Your amino acid thing. I'm going to send it to my amino
Yeah.
acid guy who has Keon aminos.
Oh, yeah.
And
Yeah,
because
no.
that was so different.
When I read that paper, I almost fell out of my chair because I
Yeah.
was like, it was so cool. It was so
So
cool.
cool.
Just like
Yeah.
looking at that map of the depletion and amino acids from all of that. And all of that, I mean, all of that stuff is real, it's going to affect how we feel. And does that mean that we need to, just like totally blow off our lives during no, it doesn't. But I do think that it means that we need to have a little bit more compassion with ourselves when we're
Hmm.
going through these things. When our body tells us that it's hungrier, we need to give it more food because our metabolism does increase during this time. And it's okay to eat when you're hungry, right?
Hmm.
Especially if you're eating things that nourish your body. And so eat,
Yeah. Yeah.
rest, and have community around you, feel supported,
Yeah.
and be able to have the conversations about how you're feeling. I think that these
Yeah.
things are all really important. And there's small little steps that you can take to try to make things better. But yeah, I don't think that you need to turn your life upside down, and I think that there's a version of this that
For each
exists out there in the
person,
world.
really.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, that's
exactly.
unique. Yeah, and
Yes.
I've definitely done that myself. And even just when I learned about how our metabolism goes up because of progesterone and how our bodies naturally crave more carbohydrates because it's preparing for pregnancy, that this is all normal and your basal metabolic temperature is rising, so it's going to help you to burn off those extra calories that you're going to be eating. It was like, oh, well, that makes sense. And it's like, well, when I crave more carbs, then in the second half of my cycle, I started to like save the ice cream and the things that maybe aren't so good for me for the second half of my cycle for an increased carb load. And when it's easy for me at the first half of my cycle, when estrogen's high and it's helping with insulin sensitivity and you don't have as many cravings, that's when I'll go lower carb. I don't eat as much garbage, like, things like that. And I work with that. And that was a big one for me. And then same with the working out where it's second half of the cycle, I don't beat myself up if I don't get to the gym or whatever and work out. It's like, well, think I'm just going to go for a walk today and
Hmm.
I'll
Hmm.
substitute. And I think that just knowing what's happening in the cycle and that there's reasons for how you're feeling the way you're feeling and working with that as best as you possibly can in today's day and age is what you can do. And I think that there is something for everyone.
Yeah, no, 100%. I completely agree. And one of the things that I talk a lot about in the book is really about trying to understand your own body's relationship with your hormonal changes because it
Yeah.
is a little bit different for everyone and giving you resources for being able to keep track of how your moods and libido and energy levels are changing and then, making recommendations for things that we can do to um, work with our body instead of working against our body. And then also just ways that we can help to take the edge off the transition between, our different hormonal states because it shouldn't feel like driving off a cliff, right? And there's a lot
No.
of things that we can do to try to improve the resilience that we have to those changes and increase our cellular plasticity.
Yeah. Now we have to talk about birth control because I
Let's
finally
do
get you
it.
on the show. I
Let's
got
do
to talk
it.
about it because really, for women that get really bad PMS, this
Mhm.
is the first line of treatment typically given when you go to your doctor. It's
Yeah.
that or SS or some sort of an antidepressant. And you
Mhm.
talked about that in your book too, which I appreciated that, it does show that there is a lot of women with PMDD or severe PMS that are helped by antidepressants. And I think that should be recognize that, hey, there is always, there is good to having some prescriptions, as much as
Right.
we
Yeah.
hate big pharma and all these things, like these can be a lifesaver for some people, literally. So I think that that's an important, like, hey, if you need to consider this, then yes, that's something that's your choice. But the other thing is the birth control is anything that's hormonal. It's like, here's your birth control younger and younger girls are being put on this, that you can get it over the counter now in the United States and many of the states. And no one has a clue, it seems like, the detrimental effects of these birth control pills. And I know that this is a whole podcast in and of itself, but if you could just kind of give us the groundwork of maybe that is not such a great idea.
Well, so it's just this, for a naturally cycling woman, you do go through these nice ebbs and flows of estrogen and progesterone, as we've talked about. And when you go on the pill, it shuts down your production of sex hormones in your own body, and then you supplant it with a daily dose of a synthetic, right? And for like a combination hormonal birth control pill, which is what most women are put on, this means having a synthetic form of progesterone called a progestin, and then a synthetic form of ethinyl. It's ethinyl estradiol. It's a synthetic estrogen. And in keeping sort of the same hormonal state every day is something that is helpful to some women with really bad PMS, because again, PMS oftentimes, like especially the really gnarly kind, is related to sensitivity to hormonal changes. And so when you
Right.
shut down your hormone production and give yourself the same daily dose of something, it's probably going to take the edge off symptoms. And for a lot of women, it does. And especially women with severe PMDD, it can be a real godsend,
Hmm.
because it does sort of shut off the source of their pain, which is experiencing the
The
physical and psychological
fluctuations.
pain that they get from those fluctuations.
Hmm.
But it also has the effect of keeping us in a state like we never get to enjoy the benefits of that estrogenic, sexy, part of our cycle. And research finds that, lo and behold, women who are using the pill tend to have lower sexual desire. They tend to have a greater risk of sexual dysfunction, relative to naturally cycling women, because they don't feel that. They also don't have that same feeling of like that peak cycle sexiness peak that women experience, where they feel so sexy and alive. That's dampened in pill takers, and so they tend to report sort of more consistent and relatively, dampened feelings of just sexiness and sort of in being in tune with their sexuality. And the other thing about hormonal birth control is that the synthetic progesterone that is in it, these progestins, are not the same as progesterone. And because of this, they don't lack a lot of the benefits that you get from progesterone. And this is because the synthetic progesterones are oftentimes made out of testosterone. And so the researchers or the chemists just alter testosterone molecules in such a way that it will stimulate progesterone receptors, but it's not a perfect match. And sometimes it'll also stimulate testosterone receptors. Sometimes it'll also stimulate glucocorticoid receptors, which are cortisol receptors. So I mean, it punches a bunch of buttons in the brain that aren't necessarily something that would normally be punched by progesterone. And on top of that, when your body is breaking down or metabolizing a progestin, it doesn't release that really beautiful that neurosteroid allopregnanolone,
Right.
because it's not made out of progesterone. It's made out of testosterone. And so when it's broken down in the body, it goes along a totally different pathway. And you don't get that calming neurotransmission that you get from actual progesterone. And this is one of the reasons that it's believed to be that women who use hormonal birth control are at a greater risk of developing depression and anxiety, is because they're lacking this really important, form of neurotransmission that is related to brain health and emotional regulation and, and mood stabilization. And so, you get a lot of changes that way. And, anytime that you take a hormone, because hormones are part of what our brain uses to create the, version of ourselves that we know of, is like me, right?
Hmm.
Like that is a product of our brain. And anytime that we change our hormones, it changes the version of ourselves that our brain creates, right? We become a different version of ourselves. And that version of ourselves is oftentimes one with more flat affect. So there tends to be less mood variability. So this means that there tends to be fewer highs, but for some women, there are fewer lows. Because of the lack of GABAergic activity in the brain, you also get a greater risk of depression. As noted, you get lower libido because of the
Hmm.
lack of estrogenic activity. And there's also been some really provocative work done looking at partner choice and mate attraction, and that women tend to be less attracted to masculinized male faces, voices, and behaviors when they're on the pills.
Masculinized?
Yeah, so like
Like just the
testosterone markers.
masculine feature. Oh,
Yeah, so one thing that we know from a lot of research is that estrogen, when it's rising across the cycle, that it tends to be related to a heightened preference for testosterone markers in men's faces, voices, and behaviors. And so estrogen sort of guides us toward those kind of like ruggedly handsome, sexy bad boy types.
yeah.
And what research finds, so researchers have been showing that for years. And then it was only more recently that researchers then asked, well, what happens when you put women on a pill and, an estrogen is kept so low? Does that mean that they are less enticed by these, testosterone marker having men, like these masculinized men? And so they've done several studies on this at this point, and what it generally tends to find is that women on the pill do tend to prefer less masculinized male faces and voices and behaviors relative to naturally cycling women. And there was even one study that suggests that women who choose their partners on the pill actually choose as partners men with the less masculinized faces relative to women who choose their partners when they're off the pill. And like when you look at these average differences, like it's important to note that these aren't like huge differences. It's not like you would look at the average, like the facial composite of the faces chosen by the pill women and then the faces chosen by the non-pill women and look at them and say, "Oh my God." Instead, there's subtle differences, but they're there. And this is because our estrogenic brain is super sensitive to really fine-tune differences in testosterone markers. And it's like when we're on the pill, we don't notice them. It's just like it doesn't really matter. And so, of course, this means if you go off the pill,
Yeah.
if you happen to have chosen a partner who has the qualities you're looking for, what research finds is that women become more attracted to their partners and they actually have higher sexual desire, which is exactly what you'd expect because all of a sudden you're cycling again, right? And you've got estrogen and you get sexual desire. And if your partner has some of these qualities related to masculinity, you're going to be really attracted to your partner and want to have sex with them. But what the research also finds is that for some women, if they chose a partner that they might not have chosen if they were naturally cycling, that you can actually
Right.
get decreases in attraction, and sometimes it can lead to relationship dissolution. And so
Right.
we've actually done some studies, or it was one big study that where we were looking at women's experiences transitioning off the pill. And what we found is that there's three buckets, right, of responses. And I forget exactly what the numbers are, but this is an approximation. About 20% of women, when they go off of it, are like, oh my gosh, my partner is so hot. And they're more attracted to their partner and their sexual desire is higher, right? So 20%. About 60% say they don't really notice a difference, right? And so they're just like not really sensitive to that and they don't really notice a difference and they feel everything is fine and it's the same. 20% of women feel less attracted to their partner and less satisfied sexually with their relationship after they go off the pill. And so it's one of these things where it's like the modal response seems to be like you're not really noticing that much, right? But there are these other groups of women and we don't know what makes those two groups of women different. If it's only about the partner they chose, if it's only about what their hormones looked like before they went on the pill and then what they look like after. We don't know if it's like what type of pill they're on. Like we don't know the answer yet to what makes that top 20% and that bottom 20% different from one another. But that's like a really interesting question and it's one that we're starting to look at.
And are we seeing anything with fertility going down with the use of birth control? Because you put these young girls, sometimes they're 13 years old. That's very common now because they get acne and, oh, we'll put them on birth control pills. Oh, you can stay on this for as long as you want. And then so there's this girl, 13 to 35, on birth control, comes off of it. And the birth control, as you said, like it suppresses your own production. So now you've had 15, 20 years of suppressing these beautiful natural hormones. That's got to be doing something.
Right. It's really interesting. So, I mean, there's kind of two questions there. So, one, like teenage birth control use, nobody's studying it. And it's
Oh,
so ridiculous. I mean, and the brain is still developing. I mean, the
Yes.
brain is developing until you're in your 20s, like mid 20s. And so when you go on the pill before your brain is done developing, it can influence brain development. It's just we don't know how, because there just hasn't really been a whole lot of research on that. But it's sorely needed because it would be miraculous for brain development not to be affected, given how intimately related hormones are to the pubertal transition and the brain development that goes on as part of puberty and transitioning from a child to a grown-up.
Because,
Hormones.
sorry to interrupt, but just does the ethinyl estradiol and progestin, did they have any positive effects on brain
I mean, ethinyl estradiol is actually a decent mimic of progesterone or of
of
estrogen.
actual?
Like
Okay.
it does a decent job. It's not as weird as progestin is just weird. I mean,
Yeah.
honestly, it's like a Franken hormone because it's like it's just like got these things where it kind of acts like progesterone, kind of acts like testosterone, kind of acts like cortisol in the body, and it's just an oddball.
Yeah.
And so there's little doubt in my mind that going on the pill as a teenager is going to have lasting effects. Whether or not those are meaningful effects, I don't know, but it would be virtually impossible for it not to have effects because brain development is influenced. I mean, it's coordinated by our sex hormones and puberty. That's why everybody
Yeah.
calls you hormonal, is because
Yeah.
they're the ones that are kind of driving the boat.
Yeah.
And then to like suppress that when your brain is developing, and that's what's coordinating brain development. I mean, it's something's going to happen. But
Like maybe
and
that's why we're having a rise in Alzheimer's disease in women because it's so estrogen and progesterone are so important for the brain. And now
yes,
there's so much research coming out about that and how HRT, taking estrogen HRT can lower your chances of getting Alzheimer's and dementia by like 70%. And it's like it's volumized. They show that yes, in some research there where it volumizes parts of the brain, estrogen. So if you're
right, yeah.
not getting that,
Yeah, no, I know. It's like not gonna, yeah, no, I know. And then progesterone is like it has all these really beautiful effects in the brain too. It like
the
promotes
myelin sheets
neuroplasticity
and
and yeah,
yeah,
it's just like really unfortunate because a lot of these girls are put on this and they have no idea what they're doing, and their doctors aren't communicating that to the parents.
no,
Because I think if they did, that people would make different decisions when they're talking about things like acne. It's
yeah,
like they would make a different decision. And so, but in terms of fertility, most of the research that's been done looking at fertility and pill use or hormonal birth control use finds that it doesn't. I mean, most women after they go off it, they're cycling within 1 to 3 months, and it's like 98% of women. So it's like it's pretty.
no,
You're
that's
able to
good.
start clicking back into gear. But I will say this, and that is that what the pill does do that is bad for fertility is it allows you to restrict your fertility voluntarily for as long as you want to, which is obviously why we take it. But it
Mhm.
also means that a lot of women are staying on it for a really long time and they decide that they want to start having kids at 35. And even though, people are able to do that, not everybody is able to do that. Fertility in women, unfortunately, begins to decline in their mid 20s.
Yeah,
20s. This is
yeah,
like when people don't feel like they even have their lives together yet. And
yeah.
so a lot of women are running into issues with fertility because they were on the pill until they were 35 and then they decided to go off it to have kids, realizing, not really realizing that their fertility is already started to decline and that it's going to be more of a challenge. And this is one thing that I feel like women aren't taught about and I think it's really too bad. I mean, it's like I don't think anybody likes the fact that our fertility declines in our 20s. Like I don't like that for women. I didn't like it for myself. Like I had my first child when I was still finishing graduate school, just because I mean I know about fertility, and I was like,
Yeah.
well, it's like I need to do it now, or it could be really challenging later on. Because I was like 29. And I was like, I should probably, at least have one before I'm 30 to make sure that everything works.
Yep.
And it's like, so I knew about that, but a lot of women aren't told about that. And then they end up in a situation, and especially if they're taking the pill for something like endometriosis or PCOS,
Yep.
which also affects fertility, right? So here they
Yes.
are on this drug to manage this condition, and then they go
To
off of it.
suppress. Yeah.
Yeah,
Not cure.
and then all of a sudden they come, there's the endometriosis and there's the PCOS, and then they can't get pregnant because they have these issues that they never dealt with because they were just
Yep.
masking them with the pill. And
Yep.
so that's another issue that tends to happen to women. So even though the pill itself doesn't seem to lead to long-term changes that affect fertility,
Which I'm
indirectly its
shocked.
use, indirectly its use is probably related to a greater risk of infertility, but just simply in these secondary ways.
Hmm. And it does, they are now saying it raises the risk of breast cancer. Not a lot,
Yeah.
but that they are starting to see that.
Yeah, and I am guessing it is the big culprit, and that is the progestin.
I think so too. Yeah.
Yeah,
Because
because
that's
even
the progestin in the Women's Health Initiative was the one that raised the breast cancer risk.
yes, and that's exactly what they just found. There was that study that was reported from Lancet Oncology over the summer where they're like, hormone therapy is bad and it's going to give you cancer. And I'm like, what? And so like I went and I read the article and I was like, this is ridiculous. The only women who had a greater cancer risk is women who were on progestin. The women using estrogen only had a lower cancer
Had a
risk.
lowered cancer
I mean, it
risk.
was
Yeah.
just like there's so much misinformation out
Yeah.
there about hormones and hormone therapy.
Yeah.
And it's like hormones are good. Progestin isn't a
Is
hormone.
not good.
It's a
Yeah.
Frankenhormone. It's like
Yeah,
not a real, it's
interesting
like
that you said that. Like, I didn't know that it was that different than ethanol, estradiol. Just they're both synthetic, and I didn't realize that it was this Franken hormone.
it
Like,
is
I
a
knew it was bad, but
Frankenhormone. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. Ethinyl estradiol does it, like I said, it's got reasonable binding specificity. So it seems to just go and do what it's supposed like what it's told. It's like go bind to some estrogen receptors, and it's like
okay,
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 I
yes,
can
I
do
will.
that. Yes, I
Yeah,
can.
yeah, yeah, and they're stronger, so your body will take that over your own production, like your own estrogen and progesterone. Like it'll same with xenoestrogens. It'll bind to the receptors but stronger than your own. So then your body
Yeah.
will take that over your own, which isn't good.
No, that's not
Always
good
your own is
either.
going to be obviously what's best or
Yes.
bioidentical.
Yes.
But the progestin, oh, and then also, isn't it true that the birth control pill, like no matter what, will cause leaky gut and like gut microbiome issues?
Yeah, I've heard that. Now, that's not my area of expertise, so I
Okay.
don't want to, I'll get over my skis if I start, trying to venture guesses about what happens there. But my understanding is that yes, and there definitely is a lot of research that finds that women's sex hormones play an important role in the microbiome.
Yeah.
And so any change that you make in that and suppressing natural hormones is gonna have an impact.
Yeah. And also, there's this mechanism that happens in cycling women where at day 12, the peak of estradiol and then the drop of estradiol initiates and upregulates the progesterone receptors, but also upregulates the P53 tumor suppressing gene.
Oh,
And
interesting. Did not,
progestin does
right.
not.
Yeah, that does not surprise me.
And it carries on
Progestin,
throughout the second half of the cycle. Like progesterone helps it to continue doing this tumor suppressing gene causing autophagy. And so it's helping. And I would think that that's how it helps with, not getting breast cancer and things like this. And
yeah,
progesterone, you're not going to get that. And then if you're suppressing with birth control, and this is only, I'm talking out my ass here. I haven't read any research about this, but I would assume that, we're suppressing our progesterone and ovulation when we're on birth control. Are you getting as much of that enzyme activity to be tumor?
yeah,
Like we want a tumor suppressing enzyme.
yeah. No, I want lots of those. I
Yeah,
want, I want so
lots.
many.
Yeah, exactly. So
So funny.
there's going to be something with that as well. And then I've also heard, and you can tell me, I don't know if this is true, but I remember hearing a doctor saying that there was some research coming out showing that birth control shrinks parts of the brain, and I think it was the hypothalamus.
Yes. No, and that is something that there's been some evidence suggesting that that is true, and it makes a lot of sense. I mean, the hypothalamus is what is like our hormone control center in our brain, and
Okay.
it helps to regulate different drives in the body. And one of the things that it does is it picks up neurotransmit. I mean, it picks up hormone transmission from hormones, and then it tells the ovaries via the pituitary gland that like, hey, like it's time to ovulate. Or like, hey, like slow down with that and let's go ahead and release that egg. And so the brain is like doing a lot to coordinate ovulation, and that's all going on in the hypothalamus. And so when you have same daily dose of a lower dose of hormone, it's not going to have as many it's not going to have as many connections. It's just going to shrink it. I mean, because it's not doesn't have to do as
It's like
much.
it's not being used, so it's like
Yeah,
atrophying.
it's like
It's like,
atrophy. Yeah, essentially it
oh, we're
is.
not
Yeah, it's
being
like
used.
well, okay. Yeah, like yeah.
Yes.
So and that one is to
Scary.
yeah, it is scary. It is scary.
We're putting these girls on this for 10, 15 years. We're destroying their gut microbiome. We're shrinking parts of their brain. They're possibly picking the wrong partners. We're not getting the tumor suppressing enzyme, maybe.
Maybe. I mean, there's all kinds of things.
Which it sucks that there isn't a great alternative that works as well, which is
Hmm.
really too bad.
Hmm.
I have a teenage daughter, and I've just taught her that she's, condoms, condoms, and more condoms. Like that's your option. And you're not going on birth control. Simple as that.
Yeah,
And she's good. Like I've taught her right out of the gate and to know her cycle, know what's happening when she's fertile, when she's not, but that she is to use condoms. So I
I
think
love
that
it.
that's what we have to start doing.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, unfortunately, we need more options,
Yeah.
because people don't love condoms. But yeah, they definitely are. I mean, it's better than like turning your hormones off completely
Yep, it
and
is.
supplanting it with a synthetic.
Yeah. And it's really the guy that gets the least out of it like
Yeah,
that. They
yeah,
can take one for the team finally,
yeah, seriously.
I remember hearing like that there was a male birth control, but they didn't want to give it to them because they got emotional on it and they lost their
They
libido.
did.
I'm like, oh
I
my
know. It's
God,
like,
seriously. Anyways,
right.
okay. Well, Sarah, I could just keep picking your brain about all of this, but I know I gotta respect your time. We've been chit-chatting for a long time now, you and I.
Yeah.
Well, I'm very thankful that you came on the show finally. I appreciate your time. And where can everybody find you?
You can find me online. I'm on all social platforms, but I'm most active on Instagram, and it's Sarah E. Hill, PhD, and that's Sarah with an H. And you can also find me on my website, and that is sarahehill.com.
And your book is officially out.
My book is officially out, The Period Brain. It's
Congratulations.
being sold everywhere that books are sold. So yeah, grab a copy for a friend.
Yes, and the other one too, the birth
Yes, this is your
control,
brain
his
on
brain
birth
on birth
control.
control,
Yeah, no,
both of them.
if you haven't read that book yet, like it's yes, it is a cultural moment.
It is.
I'm very proud of that book. And I'm proud of my new book too. But the birth control book in a lot of ways, because it came out right before people were starting to have the conversations. And it was just a really instrumental part of the
Yeah.
conversation around the pill changing. And so it's just it'll go down in my life as being one of the things I'm proudest of having done.
Absolutely. Oh, I'm so glad you wrote it. I appreciate it. Appreciate you. Thank you for coming on the show. And I
Yeah,
will put
thank you
all
for
the
having
links in the
me.
show notes and go get her books, you guys. They're great. I'm passing the period one on to my sister who
Oh, great.
struggles a lot with PMS. So I'm
Oh,
going to give
good.
that to her. Yeah.
Awesome. Good. Well, thank you.